Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome Manon Lelandais and introduce her to you very briefly. Manon is maître de conférence at the Université of Paris Cité. Basically, that's the French equivalent of an associate professor. Before that, she did teaching at Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris, and originally she has her PhD and earlier studies from the Université de Nantes. Manon is an English linguist, and I'm particularly happy that she chose a topic today that is related to our focus this semester, the relation between prosody and gesture. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing all about it. Just a note of organizational matters, we are recording this talk, but as always, we're going to stop the recording after the talk. We are not going to record the Q&A so that everybody doesn't need to be worried of asking questions and ending up on the internet. That's not going to happen. And with that, I would like to offer the floor to Manon for her talk, Vocal and Visual Boundaries in Speech, Insights from Spontaneous Speech.
First of all, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much, everyone, for having me today and for giving me the opportunity to discuss my research. I will begin this presentation with a description of my previous work, which sets the scene for the projects I want to discuss today. My studies are based on video recordings of spontaneous conversation in English. I study relationships between the information expressed in different modalities in discourse. I focus on the verbal modality, mainly through syntax and discourse analysis, the vocal modality through prosody, and the visual modality through co-speech gesture. This approach is based on the assumption that discourse is essentially built in a dynamic and interactional space, and speakers use modular, emergent resources that are constructed along the temporality of interactional sequences. In today's talk, I will refer to different groups of studies. First, a series of observational studies investigating parenthetical segments and subordinate clauses in spontaneous speech. Second, an experiment which investigates the role of prosody and gesture in the perception of boundaries in speech. And third, an ongoing study in which I try to come up with a different view of coordination from that of traditional syntax based on the presence or absence of boundaries. So let's begin with the first set of studies, which were observational. I first carried out a multimodal analysis of parentheticals in conversation and their role in interaction. You have an example of a parenthetical segment right here, which is extracted from my corpus. And the person explains what she would like to be when she finishes university, and she points out the fact that there is no strict equivalent to the job that she aspires to, which is more or less a commissioner in the UK. And in my corpus, I observed that parentheticals open a focus of attention on some object of discourse, usually, which has to be reanalyzed from the co-speaker from a new perspective, because speakers think their previous or following speech might be ambiguous. And this ambiguity can be related to the level of meta-discourse, so the disambiguation of a lexical item, or just code switching, as in this example here. It can also be related to the level of discourse in itself, so providing an explanation or a concession related to a nearby segment, or even to the level of representations, meaning the common ground that is shared between speakers and its management. And regardless of these different levels of action for parentheticals, what I found is that they are generally cut off from the ongoing discourse sequence with prosodic means, while gestures, on the contrary, are not different at all from the rest of the sequence in terms of gesture forms, but also from in terms of functions. This study was done on a fairly small corpus, and there was no statistical power to inquire into any pattern. But although I worked at the level of discourse at the time, I increasingly became interested in how some specific syntactic structures were used as frames in the interaction, which led me to build a PhD project on the use of subordination in conversation. And my project focused on the multimodal expression of appositive clauses, adverbial clauses, and restrictive relative clauses. Usually, adverbial clauses qualify the main clause process with respect to agencies such as time or cause. That's what we have here in example 2. The adverbial clause, when we were on a little road in the countryside, locates in time, I tried driving once in her car. And while an adverbial clause modifies another clause, a restrictive relative clause usually modifies a nominal expression. So in example 3 right here, the restrictive relative clause that were there creates a subcategory for the reference, the Spanish girls. And although also introduced with a relative pronoun, appositive clauses usually do not single out a nominal reference, but they make an additional comment about a nominal expression or a whole clause. And in example 4, the appositive clause, which was horrible, evaluates a place called Tropicana, which can be identified independently as a reference. And these structures have been described as dependent forms, elaborating on primary elements of discourse, but the literature shows little consensus in defining clear scopes and boundaries for these structures in syntax as in prosody. And although their verbal characteristics have been deeply analyzed, very few studies have focused on the articulation of the different communicative modalities in their production. There has been a lot of work, especially on spoken data, that has shown that syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic subordination are very different conditions, and they need not align for a same construction. So I tested whether these different syntactic types express dependence to their context in the same way, looking at the position of boundaries in discourse. And by boundary, I mean a perceptual break expressed with verbal, prosodic, and or gestural cues between two parts of speech. And my main hypothesis was based on the capacity of these constructions to show distinct forms of autonomy in function of their syntactic type. So I took into account a large set of verbal, vocal, and visual cues that had been clearly identified as boundary cues in the literature. And I carried out a series of mixed models that tested whether syntactic type had any effect on the production of these boundary cues, as well as a series of simple F-tests to see whether syntactic types were any different in the number of boundary cues that they were produced with. And the results of these studies show that, yes, subordinate constructions express different types of independence as their number of boundary cues are significantly different. More importantly, appositive clauses showed more boundaries than the other syntactic types, and the creation of these boundaries mainly relied on prosodic cues related both to rhythm and to intonation. And from these results, I wanted to switch angles and look at subordinate constructions in terms of what they do in interaction and in terms of interpretative frames, so structures of expectations on a variety of levels. And I tried to come up with a schematic representation of their impact on interaction. However, I'll set this for another day, but I'll just say that at the time, I concluded from my study that a useful development would be to work on the formal representation of the interactions and overlaps between units of a discourse sequence, since they are not the same depending on the syntactic type of subordinate constructions. And in this specific study, I showed how gesture and speech are exploiting common dimensions in various ways and temporalities in subordinate structures. Together with the verbal, prosody, and gesture, gesture form symbolic assemblies in the sense that they are blends of smaller units, mixing form and meaning. And symbolic assemblies can be found on very different scales, and those created by prosody and by gesture are complex. And I felt I had not tackled the complexity of these symbolic assemblies, and I wanted to find a way to represent them with their interactions and overlaps. And this is what my the third project I'm going to discuss today intends to do. But for now, before I talk about this, I would like to discuss a related project, this time not on the production of subordinate structures, but on their perception. The data collected on the production of subordinate constructions do not tell us whether the preferred cues for discourse segmentation in production are actually the cues that are picked up by co-speakers in perception. And this is what we were interested in for this study. And this is a collaboration with a colleague of mine from Paris Cité, Gabriel Tiberge. And one of the main methodological innovations of this study is the use of audio stimuli extracted from spontaneous speech. So the speech extracts have all been produced in dialogue settings in front of a co-speaker. And this is not something that is usually done in phonetic and prosodic studies because it is much easier to work with fully controlled stimuli. We know that during speech perception in spontaneous conversation, co-speakers rely on a wide range of simultaneous cues to support comprehension, from prosodic and gestural information to semantic context. Some of these cues facilitate the segmentation process of continuous streams of information into subunits. And the perception of prosodic boundaries is influenced by a number of acoustic cues, which are the presence of a silent pause, final syllabic lengthening, initial pitch upstep, so an upstep in pitch height, and the presence of falling or even rising tones in some languages. And we also know that people rely on gestural information to support comprehension in face-to-face conversation. And some of the visual perceptual cues used by co-speakers have been shown to facilitate the segmentation process of speech. However, in linguistics, the segmentation function of gestures in speech has mostly been documented for those gestural cues that carry strong prosodic aspects, such as beat gestures, and for major boundaries, such as end of conversational turn signals. So much less is known about the segmentation of conversational speech containing smaller scale boundaries, such as clause boundaries or tone unit boundaries. I'll only discuss hand gestures here as they were the only cue that was tested in this study. But of course, gaze direction, head movement, and eyebrow movement play a large role in speech segmentation as well. And we investigated the perceived strength of syntactic boundaries by manipulating prosodic and gestural cues in extracts of spontaneous speech. So we specifically tested whether prosody modulates the strength of syntactic boundaries first, and then whether gesture modulates the strength of perceived syntactic boundaries in a second experiment. So experiment 1 tested naive participants' ability to assess boundary strength with syntactic and prosodic cues. And listeners had to measure boundary strength for about 64 extracts on a 5-point Likert scale. I'll detail this in the next slides. Experiment 2 tested naive participants' ability to assess boundary strength with syntactic and gestural cues only. And same thing, I'll walk you through this a bit later on. The audio stimuli were extracted from a 2-hour video collection of conversational British English. And this is a collaborative corpus that gathers video recordings that were realized in soundproof studios. So we use 64 audio stimuli overall, all of them containing 3 tone units, the second one being a subordinate construction, which was established as a variable. So we had a positive relative clauses, adverbial clauses, and restrictive relative clauses in their environment. Each extract could then be described as a 1, 2, 3 sequence based on their number of tone units. Their mean duration was about 4 seconds, so very short. These extracts did not feature any prosodic cue associated with a boundary, so no silent or filled pause, no final syllabic lengthening, or no falling tone, especially between tone units 1 and tone units 2. And this was validated with a pretest. And we can play an example of those right now.
My friends that were here, they didn't go.
So you can see that speech rate is very fast because it's conversational speech.
My friends that were here, they didn't go.
And we manipulated the
My friends that were here, they did.
We manipulated the prosodic cues at the boundary between the first and second tone units in Pratt. And manipulations included adding a silent pause between 1 and 2, final syllable lengthening on the final syllable of tone unit number 1. So in here, that would be friends. What else did we add? A falling tone at the end of tone unit 1, once again on the stressed syllable, a rising tone at the end of 1 as well, and a pitch upstep at the beginning of tone unit number 2. And I'll play the same stimulus, which features 1 boundary cue, and this time it's final syllabic lengthening. So you can hear that friends has been lengthened a little bit.
My friends that were here, they didn't go.
Play it again.
My friends that were here, they didn't go.
Every stimulus was also filtered in another set, and this allowed us to make lexicosyntactic information inaccessible to participants in order to study the influence of each modality on boundary perception. And we used the pass-and band in Pratt. So when listening to filtered speech, participants have access to melodic and temporal cues. However, the influence of some suprasegmental cues is neutralized and it is impossible to identify segments. So basically we hide lexical and syntactic content, and that's what it sounds like. So that's it. And our 64 stimuli were randomized and presented sequentially to 24 British participants via a specifically designed web interface. And the test lasted approximately 40 minutes. So it was fairly long, especially for an online experiment. Experiment 2 gathers audiovisual stimuli which do not include any prosodic boundary cue, and in which only hand gestures are manipulated. So the speech stimuli were also extracted from the NVID corpus, same thing, and we only manipulated the visual aspect of the stimuli, so gestures. The variables are their alignment with speech and their configuration, and 3 different conditions were included. Condition 1 include extracts with 1 hand gesture in overlap between the end of the first tone unit and the second tone unit, supposedly conveying continuity in discourse. Condition 2 has different extracts with 2 identical hand gestures in terms of configuration, one produced in co-occurrence with a lexical item in the first tone unit, and the other produced in co-occurrence with another lexical item in the second tone unit, supposedly participating in cohesion through form, space, and direction. And these 2 identical hand gestures were separated with a return to rest position in between them. And finally, condition 3 includes extracts with 2 different gestures in terms of configuration, with one produced same thing in co-occurrence with a lexical item in the first tone unit, and the other in co-occurrence with a lexical item in the second tone unit. And this supposedly creates a boundary through form, space, and direction. So we wanted to test this. And same thing, these 2 different hand gestures are separated with a rest position as well in between them. And to design the visual aspect of our stimuli, 2 persons were filmed, producing 1 or 2 gestures depending on the condition while listening to the audio part of the stimuli. And they were following instructions regarding the timing and configuration of gestures. And the hand gestures produced by these persons belong to the categories of iconics, metaphorics, and pointing gestures. So the gestures share a semantic link with the lexical affiliate in each stimulus. And for the stimuli containing two repeated identical hand gestures, we preferred grammatical gestures. For instance, marking tense or any kind of modality, since the repetition of the same iconic gesture without the repetition of the same lexical affiliate would have given something incongruous. Each gesture is temporally synchronized with speech in that the apex of the gesture is temporally aligned with the prominent syllable, specifically its vowel onset, of the lexical affiliate. And all gestures show the same duration, amplitude, and tension, depending on each condition's requirements. And we can watch an example of the stimuli right here. And so the speaker is describing the final exam in his architecture course, and the lexical item in affiliation with the gesture produced is work. And you can see that the gesturing person draws a rectangle on a flat surface as a sheet of paper on the desk.
You get an assessed piece of work which you do on the computer using a program called AutoCAD where
I'll play it again.
you get an assessed piece of work which you do on the computer using a program called AutoCAD where
So you can see once again that speech rate is quite fast, once again, because we wanted to include conversational speech. And this stimulus belongs to condition 1, in which one single gesture is produced in overlap between the first two tone units. And our 24 stimuli were presented to 25 British participants, and the test lasted approximately 20 minutes. Because of the ordinal nature of the dependent variable, the ratings ranging from 0 to 5, we performed a series of Bayesian cumulative link models using R to account for the degree of influence of each separate variable on perceived boundary strength. And all data frames, model scripts, and posterior distributions are available on OSF. Participant and item were coded as random factors. Syntactic type was coded as a 3-level centered predictor with relative as the reference level. A small word on the Bayesian analysis framework. Bayesian modeling offers many advantages as opposed to more classical frequentist methods. They are, for instance, more appropriate when dealing with small data sets because models show less convergence failures. And based on the observed data and on a set of priors, which are more or less precise expectations on what the model should look like, a Bayesian model yields posterior distributions of possible values for each of the parameters that are being estimated. And the posterior distributions correspond to the interval and point estimates for each variable when the level of the reference variable is set to 0. So a mean value of 0 for these estimated parameters means that there is no effect of the manipulated variable on boundary strength. And this estimated mean value comes along with credible intervals, here of 95%, which represents the values between which there is a 0.95 probability of finding the real value of the estimated parameter. So we first explored the potential effect of filter as a single predictor on perceived boundary strength. And the plot you see here shows the posterior distributions for the filter variable only. As a reminder, the posterior distributions correspond to the interval and point estimates of perceived boundary strength for each variable when the level of the reference variable is set to 0. And here 0 is marked with a vertical dashed line. Quantile lines correspond to the 95% credible interval and the mean. And the 95% central part of each density ridge is filled with blue, that's what you see here, while the tails are filled with pink. And the density ridge corresponding to the filter variable is here mostly on the right of the 0 vertical dashed line. And it means that the posterior distributions calculated in this first model strongly supported the existence of an effect of filter on perceived boundary strength, with a stronger perceived boundary for filtered speech in which syntactic and lexical information is not available. This implies that in this model, prosody had an effect on syntactic boundary perception, with stronger boundaries perceived in stimuli only featuring syllabic structure and intonation, and hiding syntactic and lexical information. We then fitted a model investigating an overall effect of syntactic type with and without filtering. The figure that you see here shows violin plots for ratings in both conditions, where 0 stands for no filter and 1 stands for filter. And ratings are presented on the vertical axis, ranging from 1 for no boundary to 5 for strong boundary. And the shape of each violin plot varies in function of the distribution of answers in each rating. The quantiles are shown with horizontal white lines in each violin plot. And the black point represents the mean rating score for every syntactic type in both conditions. And the filter condition, so on the right here, shows higher ratings in perceived boundary strength overall, and the no filter condition, so on the left, shows a bit more contrasts in ratings. And in both conditions, positive clauses feature a slightly higher perceived boundary strength than adverbial and relative clauses. However, the difference in ratings is not that much overall. So our model did not show much of an effect of syntactic types on perceived boundary strength, while the same main effect of filter persisted. I'll go a bit quicker about other variables because this is not today's focus, but our explorations of interactions between isolated prosodic cues and prosodic boundary ratings show that some cues were used by naive listeners to identify boundaries across our 3 syntactic types. And these cues were silent pauses, final syllabic lengthening, and pitch reset, with all reliable effects. What is more interesting, I think, is the effect of the combination of boundary cues in one stimulus. So an extract, a speech extract, having all 3, a silent pause, final syllabic lengthening, and pitch reset. And we can see in the ratings that in both non-filter and filter conditions, ratings are higher as the number of simultaneous cues increase from 0, 1, 2, 3. And the posterior distributions calculated in our model supported the existence of an effect of the number of cues on perceived boundary strength, with a stronger perceived boundary for a higher number of cues. This model still supported a main effect of filter on perceived boundary strength, with a stronger perceived boundary for filtered speech. Now, moving on to the results of experiment 2, which investigated the effects of syntactic type and gesture type on perceived boundary strength. Looking at the overall ratings on the left in function of syntactic types, a positive display a stronger boundary score than adverbial and relative clauses. But when we look at the overall ratings by gesture condition on the right, the 3 gesture conditions lead to fairly similar ratings. So as a single predictor, gesture condition does not appear to have any effect on perceived boundary strength. The picture changes a little bit when we consider subsets for each gesture condition. And ratings for syntactic types show a bit more variety in there. The contrast specifically between each syntactic type increases in the same hand gesture condition, so with 2 identical hand gestures that are produced. And we modeled the rating dependent variable as influenced by the interaction of 2 independent variables, syntactic type and gesture coding. And the posterior distributions calculated in this model did not support the existence of an effect of gesture type on perceived boundary strength across the board. However, they moderately supported the presence of an effect of syntactic type, specifically for the same gesture condition. So stimuli containing two identical hand gestures. And this is where the discrepancy in ratings between syntactic type increases. It has to be noted that these results represent tendencies in data that moderately support the presence of an effect. So more data for this test is needed to verify this. If we sum up, as a single predictor, gesture condition did not have any effect on perceived boundary strength. Our data moderately supported the presence of an effect of syntactic type increased in the same gesture condition, which was very unexpected. And the prosodic value of gestures is often referred to while studying speech segmentation, especially that of beat gestures or head and eyebrow movements. And in this test, we did not include any variable related to the prosodic value of gestures. And on the basis of experiment 2, we cannot say that speech segmentation can be achieved with other types of hand gestures, but very surprisingly, according to our model, two identical hand gestures are the most likely to trigger a response. And I'll be able to discuss this trend later on during the questions if you're interested in this. So we can say from these two experiments that we confirm that prosody modulate the strength of perceived syntactic boundaries, but we did not confirm that gesture modulate the strength of perceived syntactic boundaries. And we did observe a trend with hand gestures showing identical configurations, but as I said, it has to be further verified. So what do we get from this and where do we go from there? Our study reveals differences in perceived boundary strength with stimuli containing different types of subordinate clauses, and it contributes in this sense to the exploration of the interface between syntax and prosody and between syntax and gesture. These results cannot be explained in terms of constituent length, sequential position, or prosodic cues, since these parameters were controlled. However, constituent complexity and weight remain potential factors. Specifically, the degree of potential syntactic closure varies in between segments. Some of the adverbial clauses, especially, are preceded by a potential full syntactic closure, while others are preceded by a nominal clause which projects a verbal clause. So this might play a role here. It has to be noted that our two perception tests are different in the number of cues included as variables, and the motivations of this specific test were merely exploratory, since no study had documented the segmentation values of gestures without any prosodic quality. And we were also bound to having very few stimuli because of the online nature of the test. So the most immediate and straightforward development of this study would be to increase the number of participants to probe the strength of the effects. And we aim at improving the spontaneous aspect of the stimuli. One of their advantages is that they have been produced in the presence of an interlocutor, but in our data, the fact that the gesturing persons follow instructions remain another important limitation, which plays a role in the significance of our results. Now that we've discussed subordination from both production and perception sides, I will now describe the first step of a new research project that focuses on a global approach to coordination in discourse. And for this, I would like to thank two colleagues from KU Leuven, Geert Broon and Kurt Feyerts, whose insight I benefited from throughout the conception of this study. And more precisely, this very much exploratory, once again, project aims at describing the verbal, vocal, and gestural features contributing to coordination in English. And it relies on a corpus of audiovisual recordings of unprepared dialogues, semi-scripted TV talk shows, and television news. And in this talk, I only focus on the spontaneous conversation component of the corpus, And I will only discuss an example that gives an idea of the new definition of coordination I'm working with. Traditional examples of coordinate constructions are examples 5 and 6 from the corpus. Example 5 has a lexical marker, which is a conjunction, but, while example 6 has and as a lexical marker. And although coordination has received substantial attention in different subfields of linguistics, its multimodal realization in real life interaction still remains unexplored. And I assume a different approach from my previous studies, which so far have investigated how syntax is reflected in other speech components. Here, I try to take a larger point of view that focuses on multimodal aspects of meaning without taking syntax as the defining feature of coordination. So I study coordination as a dynamic phenomenon that takes place between symbolic structures at a conceptual level, which can be expressed with verbal, vocal, and gestural forms. I'll say a bit more about this later on, but the new definition I'm working with helps comparison between different languages and is not specific to syntax. So my focus here is a description of coordination in function of discourse sequence type and in function of discourse genre. And I look at coordination through the prism of one phenomenon only, that is the expression, once again, of boundaries in speech. And the main hypothesis is based on the capacity of coordinate structures to show recurrent verbal, vocal, and gestural marks. And coordinate constructions have been described in cognitive and construction grammars as a grammatical manifestation of the mental juxtaposition of co-equal structures, which cannot be characterized by semantic criteria alone. However, it is not clear whether and how the co-equal structures relate to one another. And coordination has mostly been studied in other subfields of linguistics, with a strong focus on syntactic features. They are seen as syntactic structures in which two or more units of the same type are combined to form a larger unit and still have the same semantic relations with other surrounding elements. And the units may be words, phrases, or full sentences, and they traditionally do not exhibit any syntactic or semantic mark of dependency. So based on my main hypothesis, if, as described as in the syntactic literature, coordinate constructions are parallel structures in terms of weight and complexity, there should be a boundary between them expressed with syntactic, discourse, prosodic, and or gestural means. And the number and nature of boundary cues are expected to be different in function of each discourse format, spontaneous conversation, interview, and TV news, and in function of discourse sequence type. And in here, I've got 4 modalities: narrative, argumentation, question-answer pairs, and descriptions. And for this, I use video datasets, once again here of spontaneous conversation. And additionally, I use video datasets of spoken American English belonging to the distributed Little Red Hen Lab as part of the UCLA Newscape archive. And I use the Pratt and Elam software for the prosodic and gestural annotation of the data. Annotations are made regarding syntax, discourse, prosody, and gesture. And for this study, hand gestures, head movements, eyebrow movements, and gaze direction. So the first step is the annotation into formal units. In terms of syntax, I annotate in terms of phrases and clauses. The discourse annotation, as I said before, focuses on the segmentation of the corpus in discourse sequences. And I also segment the corpus in speech turns. For the prosodic coding of the corpus, I segment speech in tone units according to the British School of Intonation based on dynamic pitch contours. And the Momo InSynth algorithm that you can see on the last tiers, 7 and 8, is used for the automatic annotation of pitch height, so F0 target points in the signal. And we've got pitch height, absolute values in here, and tier 8 is about the relative value of pitch height compared to the preceding point. The nature of each nuclear contour in turn units is coded manually as well as pitch key. And of course, in order to establish reliability on these manual annotation, a second coder judges about 20% of the data classified by the original coder. Gesture annotation is based on Camden's gesture phrases. Head movements are labeled into nods, shakes, tilts, jerks, and what did I forget? Beats. And in separate tracks, gaze direction was annotated as either towards the co-participant or away, and eyebrow movement distinguished in between rise and frown. For hand gestures, I code formal features such as direction and gestural space, following the parameters defined by Bressem and Ladevig. And I also code hand gestures considering their link with co-occurring speech and their relationship with lexical affiliates with McNeil's typology. So I said earlier that coordination is a dynamic phenomenon that takes place between symbolic structures at a conceptual level, which can be expressed with verbal, vocal, and gestural forms. But what are the implications of this definition in terms of annotation? I came up with a more precise definition of coordination and a more precise working definition. So to me, two labels are coordinates when they are temporally contiguous and when they are interchangeable. If they can be interchanged, they represent as a whole a single consistent function depending on the level of analysis, whether it be discourse or the interaction. And the rationale behind this definition is based on studies aiming at describing coordination cross-linguistically and on studies aiming at improving the automatic recognition of coordination in NLP studies. What these studies told us is that coordination takes place in some languages without a separate lexical item, with differing structural relationships between the coordinates, with subtly varying semantics, and sometimes with no overt marking at all. And this aims at avoiding syntactic circularity. You can have coordinate structures without any conjunction or any other lexical marker here. This working definition will be tested on a subset of data and will be submitted to inter-rater validity. I'm very much looking forward to this. Each coordinate label is identified as C1, C2, C3, so they can be stacked. So where are we now in the project? A few numbers. As I said earlier, the project has just started, and so far 330 labels have been annotated as coordinates, and only about 12.5% of the corpus has been treated. So we still have a lot to uncover. Almost 200 labels that have been annotated as coordinate belong to the verbal modality, while 131 labels annotated as coordinates are gestures only. And only the hand gestures have been annotated yet. This being said, let's see how the new definition works with an example in which coordination is to be found in gesture units only and not with verbal units. Example 7 is part of a question-answer discourse sequence, and Alex on the left has just asked for details about Rihanna's studies. And Alex on the left will make two similar hand gestures.
I mean, I'm on holiday now, but
Yeah.
I've been studying law for the past 2 years.
Okay, so you're going into what, third year?
Third year, I managed to pass, and I don't know how I did it.
So I'll play that again. These are very small gestures.
I mean, I'm on holiday now, but
Yeah.
I've been studying law for the past 2 years.
Okay, so you're going into what, third year?
Third year, I managed to pass, and I don't know how I did it.
So when she says, you're going to what, Alex makes a small pointing gesture with her right hand, and she rotates her wrist so that her palm is up. And this gesture belongs to the ring shape. It works as an interactional gesture since she briefly points towards Rihanna, her co-speaker, with her index finger, and it highlights her question. We could also say that this gesture has a strong grammatical component since it co-occurs with going and locates the future time on a left to right axis. And then she makes a second very similar hand gesture as she answers her own question with third year. And she opens her hand a bit more and rotates a bit more to the right. And once again, the gestures are very similar in terms of handedness, shape, and direction. However, her gaze is extremely mobile. She looks away from Rihanna during C1, but she looks back at her at the end of the unit. Then she gazes away again during C2, and she looks back at Rihanna once again at the end. So if we have a boundary expressed with gesture in the sequence at all, it would be with her gaze only. And of course, her gaze works as an appeal since she's asking a question. Let's now see what happens in terms of prosody in that same example. We can play the extract again.
Okay, so you're going into what, third year?
Third year.
Okay, so you're going into what, third year?
Third year.
So in here, we've got prosodic continuity between C1 and C2, which is achieved with rhythmic and intonational cues, since we have what we call a rush-through intonation. Speech rate is increased during C1, and the syllables are uttered so fast that there's a flat intonation during C1, as shown with the S in synth marks, which stand for same pitch height as before. And we can see that the beginning of C2 is almost as high as the end of C1. And then we have a rising tone accompanying the yes-no question. And it's a big rising tone since pitch height is at the top of Alex's range, with InSynth telling us that it's at the top. We only have a boundary after C2. So in here, prosody marks cohesion and not at all disruptions, as we've seen in other studies, for instance. And based on these very small initial observations, I have two main research questions. There's the question of the role of weight on boundaries, because two very long units that are coordinated versus two very short units means that surely articulatory weight, phonological weight, and syntactic weight play a role in boundary strength. So that has to be taken into account in the analysis, maybe in terms of a weighting scale when we build models, but we're not there yet. And the second question is about the role of discourse sequence type on coordination, of course, because we've only discussed a question-answer pair here. And the corpus will include two other discourse genres than spontaneous conversation, in which interactions, of course, show different degrees of control. And a quantitative analysis will be conducted on the amount of boundary cues collected with each occurrence of coordination. In terms of direction, the next step is to enlarge the spontaneous component of the corpus with more dialogues to be recorded. And another development of these studies lies in the interoperability of annotations. As I said earlier, the definition of coordination I'm working with is influenced by studies in natural language processing. And I would also like to work on the applicability of my annotations in NLP and computational linguistics, especially in terms of granularity. Most linguistic frameworks still struggle with finding an account for coordination, that is descriptively fully adequate. And from an NLP perspective, coordination is one of the major sources for parsing errors. And since linguistic frameworks are challenged by the diverse phenomena of coordination, a consistent annotation of coordinate structures is necessary. And we also need a reliable detection of coordinate structures as such, but also of the boundaries in between their conjuncts. And finally, I'd like to address one long-term potential development. It could be relevant to initiate a comparison of coordination with pathological speech, in both cases using connected speech. Because speech therapists and clinicians need multimodal data in linguistics in order to draw comparisons following protocols in discourse analysis. And data such as that created with a project like this one can be useful as a baseline regarding the classification of disfluencies, especially with boundaries, or regarding the use of some syntactic structures. But of course, this requires a lot of preparation in terms of data interoperability. And such data is used with motor or physiological speech pathologies, such as Parkinson's, or with neurological pathologies, such as aphasia. And clinicians dealing with mild cognitive impairments, especially, are increasingly using discourse analysis and linguistic features for the identification of early biomarkers, since regular neuropsychological measures often do not allow for an early detection or characterization of numerous pathologies. So there's an avenue of thought in here, reflection. And of course, some cognitive processes are known to be shared between speech and gesture because of studies showing that speech disorders are accompanied with gesture disorders. So more data to document this complex relationship will enlarge the detection and evaluation of language pathologies as well. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be glad to hear your feedback and answer your questions. Sorry about that last slide.